In July of 1945, the crew of the USS Indianapolis thought the hard part was over. They had just finished a top-secret run across the Pacific to deliver the bomb that would end World War II. And everyone on board believed they were finally going home as heroes. But they never made it. Just 4 days after dropping off that cargo, the ship vanished. It didn't happen in a glorious battle. It happened in the middle of the night, in 12 violent minutes that dumped 900 men into the black water of the Pacific. They were left drifting in the dark without food, without fresh water, and, worst of all, without anyone knowing they were missing. As the sun came up on that first morning, the men thought the worst was behind them. But as the oil slick cleared, they looked down into the water and realized they were floating directly over a feeding ground. This isn't just a story about a shipwreck. It's a story of the 4 longest days in naval history, a nightmare of thirst madness, and the deadliest shark attack ever recorded. To really understand why this tragedy happened, you have to understand the immense pressure these men were under. It was the summer of '45, and while the war in Europe had ended, the fight in the Pacific was getting bloodier every day. The U.S. was preparing for an invasion of Japan that was predicted to cost 1 million American lives. So the military was desperate for an alternative. That alternative was sitting in a wooden crate bolted to the deck of the Indianapolis. Inside was the uranium core of the atomic bomb. The mission was so secret that even Captain Charles McVeigh wasn't allowed to know what he was carrying. His orders were simply to get to the island of Tinian as fast as humanly possible. And that's exactly what they did. The Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser built for speed, and she raced across the ocean without an escort, setting a record that actually still stands today. When they finally unloaded that crate in Tinian on July 26th, you can imagine the relief. The crew of nearly 1,200 men finally exhaled. They were ordered to head to the Philippines for some routine training, which, to the young sailors on board, felt like a vacation compared to what they had just done. They spent those few days playing cards on deck and writing letters home, completely unaware that a series of mistakes was happening in the command centers that would seal their fate. Before leaving Guam, Captain McVeigh had actually asked for an escort destroyer because he knew those waters were dangerous. But his request was denied. He was told the route was perfectly safe, even though an American ship had been sunk in that exact sector just days before. That intelligence was never passed on to McVeigh. So on July 28th, the Indianapolis sailed out of the harbor alone, heading straight into a trap. By Sunday night, July 29th, the weather had turned. The clouds were heavy, blocking out the moon and stars, which convinced Captain McVeigh that his ship was hidden by the darkness. He ordered the ship to stop zigzagging to save time and went in his cabin to get some sleep. But then the clouds broke. For just a few seconds, the moon came out and silhouetted the massive ship against the horizon. And unfortunately, Commander Hashimoto of the Japanese submarine I-58 was watching through his periscope at that exact moment. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had a massive American capital ship sailing in a straight line right across his sights. At 12:14 a.m., the world ended. The first torpedo didn't just hit the ship, it severed the bow completely. Before the crew could even register the shock, the second torpedo slammed into the midship, hitting the fuel tanks and the powder magazine. The explosion was apocalyptic. It effectively split the ship in half, killing all power instantly. The lights died, the engine stopped, and the radio room was incinerated before they could verify if a distress signal had even gone out. Down in the sleeping quarters, it was pure chaos. Men were thrown from their bunks into a world of fire and rushing water, scrambling up ladders in the dark while choking on smoke. The ship began to roll onto its side, like a dying animal. Captain McVeigh, who had been thrown from the bridge, found himself in the water looking up at the stern of his own ship, rising hundreds of feet into the air. He could still see the massive propellers turning, chopping the night air, until the ship gave a final groan of twisting steel and plunged beneath the surface. It took only 12 minutes, in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. A 600-foot cruiser was erased from the map. In the silence that followed, 900 survivors found themselves bobbing in a thick, choking layer of black fuel oil. They were terrified, wounded, and covered in sludge, but they held on to one specific hope. They were the Navy. They were overdue. They figured rescue would be there by noon. But because of a clerical error at the port in Leyte, the ship had been marked as arrived before it even got there. No one was looking for them. No rescues coming. When the sun rose on Monday morning, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The survivors tried to organize themselves, linking arms to form rafts and putting the wounded in the center. The water was warm, which seemed like a blessing at first, but the explosion had done something else. The vibrations, the sinking ship, and the blood in the water had sent a dinner bell ringing across miles of open ocean. Curiosity brought the first visitors. Oceanic white-tip sharks. Jacques Cousteau once called them the most dangerous of all sharks because, unlike great whites, white-tips are open ocean scavengers. They are aggressive, they are opportunistic, and they never hunt alone. At first, they just circled the groups. The men held their breath, tucking their legs up to their chests, watching hundreds of dark fins cutting the surface of the water. The attacks didn't start with a frenzy. They started with the stragglers, targeting the bodies of the men who had died during the night. The survivors had to watch in horror as the bodies of their friends were tugged violently underwater. But once the dead were gone, the sharks turned to the living. When a shark attacked, it usually came from below. A man would simply disappear with a sharp gasp, followed by a pool of red blooming in the water. The men learned quickly that panic attracted them. Thrashing attracted them. So they formed tight circles back to back, kicking and screaming underwater if a shark got too close. Just imagine the psychology of that first night. The sun goes down, leaving you in total darkness. You can't see your own legs. You can't see the man floating 10 feet away from you, but you can hear. You hear a splash. You hear a scream that gets cut short, and you hear the crunch of bone. You know they're feeding, and you know you might be next. You find yourself praying for the sun to rise, just so you can see death coming. By Tuesday, the sharks were no longer the biggest threat. The sun was floating on the equator. The men were baking in 100-degree heat with no hats and no shade. The sun blistered their skin, and the salt water peeled the blisters away, leaving them raw. But the real killer was the thirst. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. And being surrounded by an infinite ocean you can't touch is a cruel kind of torture. By Wednesday, the discipline finally broke. As dehydration caused their brains to swell, the hallucinations began. Tragically, the madness was contagious. One man would shout that he saw an island. or a hotel beneath the waves serving ice water. He would dive down into the black abyss to find it and never come back up. Others believed the ship hadn't sunk at all, but was hovering just below the surface. Then the saltwater poisoning took hold. Desperate men broke the rule and drank the ocean. Within an hour, the salt sent their minds into a violent psychosis. They didn't just die, they went mad. They began flailing and attacking their shipmates with knives, believing they were Japanese spies. The survivors were forced to do the unthinkable. To stop the thrashing, which was attracting more sharks, they had to hold their own friends underwater until they stopped moving. By the end of the third day, the group of 900 had shrunk to less than 400. Captain McVeigh, floating on a potato crate, watched his crew disintegrate around him. He kept begging them, "Just hold on one more hour. They know we are missing. They are coming." He was wrong. They were ghosts. By Thursday morning, day 4, death was all but guaranteed. But then pure chance intervened. Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn was flying a routine patrol bomber overhead. He wasn't looking for survivors. In fact, he was barely looking at the ocean at all. He was distracted, trying to fix a broken antenna wire in the tail of his plane. But he happened to glance down at the exact right moment. He saw a long smear of oil on the water. At first, he assumed it was an enemy submarine surfacing to recharge, and he actually prepared to drop a depth charge to sink it. But as he dove the plane closer, the shape resolved. He didn't see a steel hull. He saw heads, hundreds of them, bobbing in the sludge. Gwynn immediately radioed the base. Many men in water. The command center was confused. What men? What ship? No ship was reported missing, but they dispatched a PBY Catalina seaplane, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, to go check it out. When Marks arrived on the scene, he looked down and saw a horror movie. He saw the sharks attacking, dragging men under right in front of his eyes. Now, Marks had strict standing orders. Do not land. The ocean swells were 12 feet high, and landing a seaplane in those conditions would likely rip the hull apart. But Lieutenant Marks looked at the water. Then he looked at his crew, and he decided to throw the rule book away. He landed the plane. It bounced violently, popping rivets and taking damage, but it stayed afloat. Marks taxied right into the group of survivors. Since he couldn't take off again, he turned his plane into a giant life raft. He pulled men inside until the fuselage was full. Then he started pulling men onto the wings, using parachute cords to tie them down so they wouldn't slide off. That night, the darkness returned. But this time, there was a light. The PBY turned its searchlight up onto the clouds, creating a beacon for the rescue ships. For the first time in 4 days, the sharks stayed away. The rescue ships arrived the next morning. But when the final count was done, the scale of the tragedy was heartbreaking. Of the 1,195 men who sailed on the Indianapolis, only 316 came out of the water alive. 879 men were dead. The Navy was humiliated. The public was furious. How could the most powerful military in the world lose a capital ship and not know about it for 4 days? The families of the dead wanted answers, and the Navy decided they needed a villain to take the fall. They chose Captain Charles McVeigh. McVeigh became the only captain in U.S. Navy history to be court-martialed for losing a ship to an act of war. The trial was essentially a setup. The Navy hid the evidence that McVeigh had been denied an escort. They buried the fact that the SOS signals were ignored. In a move that shocked the world, the prosecutor even brought in the enemy, Makitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander, to testify against McVeigh. Even though Hashimoto admitted that zigzagging wouldn't have saved the ship, it didn't matter. The verdict was guilty. McVeigh was stripped of his seniority and his reputation was ruined. But his punishment was far worse than a demotion. For the next 20 years, McVeigh received hate mail. Every Christmas, the families of the dead men would send him cards that simply said, "You killed my son." He carried the weight of 879 ghosts. Finally, on a cold November day in 1968, Charles McVeigh walked into his backyard. He held a toy sailor in one hand, a good luck charm he had kept for years, and his service pistol in the other. He took his own life. He was the last casualty of the USS Indianapolis. But the story didn't end in that backyard. Decades later, a 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott watched the movie Jaws. He heard the character Quint tell the story of the Indianapolis, and he became obsessed. He decided to do a history project on it. Hunter Scott started interviewing survivors. He started digging into the Navy archives, and he found the documents that proved the captain was innocent. His school project went all the way to Congress. In October 2000, 55 years after the sinking, the United States Congress passed a resolution officially exonerating Captain McVeigh. President Bill Clinton signed it. Today, the wreckage of the Indianapolis lies 18,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. It is a grave of iron and silence. But the 316 men who survived the sharks, the thirst, and the madness proved something that no court-martial can take away. The human will to live is stronger than the ocean. The survivors of the Indianapolis faced a horror we can barely imagine. But what happens when experienced explorers walk into a horror they cannot explain? If you want to join us as we investigate the unexplainable, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell. Next, we are traveling back 3,000 years to investigate the Bronze Age collapse, the moment when every major city on Earth was suddenly burned to the ground at the same time. Who were the mysterious sea peoples who arrived by boat to destroy the world? And where did they vanish to? It is the original apocalypse. You don't want to miss it.